Joe of the Chalet School. Chapter 21. An Unpleasant Problem. Thanks to the doctor's rapidity of treatment, and also to the treatment itself, nobody was much the worse for the dunking, so far as bodily comfort went. But there was a certain amount of unpleasantness over it. For one thing, the juniors were forbidden ever to play near the brook again, no matter who was with them. For another, it was requested that, for the remainder of the term, walks should be avoided on that side of the valley, and should be taken either up to the Barnbald Alp or in the Seaspitz direction. Hitherto no one had minded much where the walks went, but it only needed this prohibition to fill all the middles at any rate with a deep desire to go to the Geeslem direction. Even Frida, the law-abiding, was overheard to say that she wished Madame had not made that rule. As for Grizel, she was nearly speechless with indignation. Nearly, but not quite. She managed to rake up enough breath from somewhere to voice her disgust. "It's too bad," she wailed. "The water from the dripping rock will be simply shooting down, and I did want to see it in full swing." Thus reminded of the rock, which overhung part of the way to Geeslem, and over which water trickled from a spring at the top on to the footpath, making it necessary to rush past at full speed, a proceeding not unattended by danger, since the path had broken away here, and the lake was deep at this point. Everyone was seized with a deep desire to see what it would be like now. "I expect it's a regular waterfall," said Joey mournfully. "Oh, I should like to see it." "I also," put in Simone, who was standing at her elbow, as usual. It was significant that no one suggested going to the head and asking her to remove her embargo. They had learnt by this time that when Miss Bethany said no, she meant no. "It's all your fault, Simone," cried Margia unexpectedly. "Yes, it is," as Simone bristled up furiously. "If you'd never played with those idiotic paper dolls of yours, we wouldn't have had them. If you hadn't had them, you wouldn't have got tired of them. If you hadn't got tired of them, you wouldn't have given them, some of them anyway, to Robin. "Oh, choke her off, somebody, do," groaned Grizel. "It's worse than the house that Jack built. Dry up, Margia, and give someone else a chance to talk. The amount you do, it's impossible to get a word in edgewise." "Madame has said we cannot go there, so we can't go there, and that's an end of it. Now shut up, and talk about something else." "Shut up yourself," Margia was beginning heatedly, when Miss Bethany appeared on the scene. "Grizel, Margia, is that a way to talk when you're by yourselves? I think I'd better send someone to sit with you children during your free time, if this is the case. Clear away those books at once, and put this room tidy. It's more like a pigsty than a form room in a school. And please don't let me hear any of you talking like little hooligans again." She walked off, leaving them all angry and rather afraid that she might carry out her threat and send someone to sit with them while they played. "It'll be Grizel's fault if we do," said Joey, who was feeling the effects of the spring weather and was cross and out of sorts. She wandered over to the window and stared dismally out at the high fence, which cut off the view of the lake. There was little else to see, although in a week or fortnight time the ground would be green with the young grass. "What are you staring at?" demanded Margia unamiably. "You might come and lend a hand instead of gawping out of the window like that at nothing." "Gawping is slang," pointed out Joey, somewhat priggishly. "It must be confessed. You're breaking the rules." "You're so particular yourself," fumed Margia, who felt that this was adding insult to injury, and resented it accordingly. "You have never heard me say gawp," maintained Joey self-righteously. "I've heard you say a dozen worse things," retorted Margia. "Oh, Simone," for Simone had burst into tears. "You are so unkind," she sobbed. "Always it is me who must do the work. But always." "Oh, for goodness sake, stop it," groaned Joe. Almost on the words, the door opened, and Mademoiselle came in. "Simone, why are you crying?" she asked dramatically. Simone sobbed. "In English, please." Simone gulped noisily and then wailed, "I do not know." "It's the spring," said Miss Durant, who had been standing behind her, an uninterested spectator of all this. "She ought to have some sulphur or something to cool her down a little." At this lively prospect, Simone literally howled, bringing Miss Bettany to the spot. She gave the French child short shrift. "Off to bed with you," she said. "A dose of salts will put you right. Come here, you others. Joey, let me see your tongue." Joey obligingly hung it out as far as it would go, and Margio followed her example. Miss Bettany promptly decided to dose them all round, and went off to superintend the mixing of a big jarum of sulphur, lemon juice, tartaric acid, and one or two other items. At 7 o'clock the next morning she made the round of dormitories and saw to it herself that every girl took a dose. The next day Mrs. Squeers, as Naughty Joe promptly christened her sister, appeared again with her medicine. All swallowed their doses in silence. Work that day proceeded as usual. The only thing that was not usual was the behavior of the dogs. Usually quite happy with their freedom of the enclosure and the long walk they always had with the girls in the afternoon, today they were restless and unhappy. Zita prowled up and down the fence nearest the Prawn-Kritz Carl, and Torrent every now and then sitting down on her haunches and baying mournfully, an example fearfully imitated by her son, who yelped loudly. "I can't think what has happened to those dogs," said Miss Bettany during the 10:30 break, as she stood by the gate, talking to Miss Maynard and watching the girls who were wandering about in twos and threes. "I never knew Zita to behave like this before." "You know the old idea that a dog howls at the approach of death," said Miss Maynard. "Marie has been wailing about it whenever we've met," replied Miss Bettany. "She's convinced that something awful is about to happen. But you aren't superstitious, surely?" Miss Maynard laughed half-ashamedly. "I'm not, as a general rule. But there's certainly something wrong with Zita, and Zita knows it. Animals always sense coming disaster, I think. Dogs and cats especially." "She may be feeling unwell," suggested Madge. "Let's go and examine her." They strolled across to where Zita stood with Rufus nuzzling against her, and Joey petting them both, the ever-faithful Simone beside her. She looked up at the two as they came near. "I can't think what's the matter with Zita," she said seriously. "I've loved her and talked to her, and she only howls. Oh, do you think she's ill?" "Let me see," said her sister, bending over the big dog. Zita turned mournfully her eyes to her young mistress. Then she lifted her nose to the sky and gave utterance to her long howl. Miss Bettany patted her head and felt her nose. "Poor old Zita! I wish you could tell us what you are so unhappy about." "What is it, my dear? Have you hurt your paw? Let me see." Zita allowed them to examine her feet one by one, but there was nothing wrong with them. "Is she going to die?" asked Joey, almost tearfully. "Nonsense, Joey," replied her sister sharply. "I don't know what can be the matter, but she's well enough in herself." "Perhaps she wants a long walk," suggested Miss Maynard. "She seems terribly restless. Look at her." For Zita was once more pacing along the fence. Miss Bettany looked at the dog and then glanced round. "I've a good mind to send the girls for their walk now, and let them have their lesson this afternoon. Look at the sky. There's a storm threatening in the near future." Miss Maynard nodded. "You're quite right. There it is. Isn't this Mr. Denny's afternoon, though? There won't be much time for lessons." "Coffee can be half an hour late for once," and Mr. Denny has them in 3 classes, so we'll cut the middle sewing, and they can have my history instead. I don't suppose they will object. There's the bell. Send Gisela round to the various forms to tell them to get ready, and ask Miss Durant if she will take the middles and the seniors. Juliet and Gisela can take the juniors. They are to walk round the lake at Bracow and back. The little ones had better go further than see Spitz. This is a very tiring weather. It's horribly oppressive, agreed Miss Maynard, as she set off on her errand. Needless to state, the girls were charmed at the idea, and 10 minutes later were all ready. Then a strange thing happened. Joey went, as usual, to fetch the dog. Rufus came eagerly enough, but Zita merely looked at her pathetically and bayed again. She simply refused to stir from where she was. "What a strange thing," said Madge, when she heard Joey's report. "I do hope she's all right. Leave her, Joe, if she won't come, but take Rufus." However, when she saw the 2 long files of girls marching down to the gate, Zita reluctantly left her post and followed them, although she kept looking back at the 3 mistresses who were left behind. "I simply don't understand it," said Miss Bethany. "Zita has never behaved like this before." "It is the spring, perhaps," suggested Mademoiselle. "It is affecting the young girls, and why not the dog, too?" "That must be it," agreed Madge. "Well, shall we go for a stroll in the other direction? We might go out of the pine wood gate and walk down by the river and along the lake path home. What do you say?" "I have much to do, chérie," said Mademoiselle. "If you will forgive me, I will stay behind and finish my work." "You need a walk, really," said her head. "However, if you want to work—" "I ought to stay too," laughed Miss Maynard. "I have a pile of algebra books to correct. But they can come later on, and I'll come with you now." They set off across the enclosure to the gate, which opened on to the pasture. Close by the pine woods, at the base of the slopes of the Barnbald Alp. There was no wind today, and the woods were very still. The only sound they could hear was the roaring of the torrent as it thundered down the valley to the lake. "What a noise the water makes!" exclaimed Miss Maynard as they neared it. A sudden turn in the road had brought them in full view of the stream, and a magnificent sight it was, the grey foaming water tossing and boiling between its narrow rocky banks, fighting every inch of its way to the Tarnsee. It was a bare 6 inches below the summit of its banks, and it looked to Madge Bethany as if it must, ere long, overlap them and fling itself across the valley. She remembered it as it had looked on the hot day in summer, when they had gone dry-shod over the pebbles on their way to the Mondschenspitz for her birthday picnic. She recalled, too, how Brunhilde had told her that 3 bridges had been swept away by the winter floods, so that now there was only a log across it. She glanced down to where she knew the log to be, and felt a little wave of thankfulness to see it still there. "Here's Herr Braun," said Miss Maynard suddenly. Madge looked up and saw the good-natured hotel-keeper coming to meet them. His face was very grave, and all the cheerfulness seemed to have fled from it. "Grüß Gott, Fräulein," he said as he reached them. "Grüß Gott, Herr Braun," replied Madge. Then she added, "The stream is very full, isn't it?" "Too full, mein Fräulein, too full," he said. "How do you mean, too full?" asked Madge, paling slightly. He explained. "As you can see, gracious lady, the banks are narrow, and there is a great deal of snow still melting. That means that there is much water still to come down. If it should occur that the water was dammed higher up, then, when the dam broke, as assuredly it must be, there would be little or no room for the flood to pass to the lake, and it would overflow and flood the valley." "Has it happened before?" asked Miss Maynard. "Twice within my recollection. Once the village up yonder," he pointed up the valley, "was completely overwhelmed, and there were many lives lost. It is why all the houses are now built on the higher ground, while many are raised off the ground together. The other time it was not so serious, but still much of the valley was several inches under water for 2 days, and there were many goats drowned. "And do you think there will be a flood now?" demanded Madge. He shook his head. "Der liebe Gott knows, and he only. At least, mein Fräulein, you are safe and the little ones, for the chalet stands high. Nevertheless, if you will permit that I advise you, I should suggest that you take food with you tonight upstairs. If there should be a storm, it might chance that the water will rise high enough to make it unpleasant for you to eat in the lower rooms. It would soon drain away to the lake, but it is always well to be prepared." By this time they had reached the Crown Prince Karl, and he bade them farewell, repeating his advice about the food. Then he left them, and they walked home along the lake path. "What shall you do?" asked Miss Maynard of her head. "I wish I knew." Miss Bethany looked worried. "If I thought there really should be a flood, as he suggests, I should take the girls to Seespitz and ask them to take us to the Gauschhof for the next few days until the water goes down. But I don't want to do that unless it's absolutely necessary." She paused then. "What do you think yourself?" she asked. Miss Maynard frowned. "I really don't know. It's fearfully difficult to decide." Mademoiselle, tackled on the same subject, held the view that doubtless Herr Brahm was exaggerating the danger. She also pointed out that the Crown Prince Karl lay much nearer the stream, and also that it lay at a lower level than the chalet, and therefore might quite possibly be damaged by a flood, while the school stood high and dry. The ringing of the bell for Mittagessen put an end to the discussion, and nothing more was said. After lunch, the afternoon's engagements were explained to the girls. The juniors would have their singing as usual at 1:30, while the middles had history and seniors mathematics. Then the middles would have their singing lesson, and the juniors would make up the French they had missed in the morning. It would be the turn of the seniors for singing, and the middles and juniors would do English literature and German dictation, respectively. Finally, all the school were to have half an hour's folk songs at the end of the afternoon instead of the beginning, and Miss Bethany made the announcement that set everyone gasping with surprise. "After we leave the table," she said, "everyone will go over to La Petite Chalet. The juniors will bring their night things, brushes and combs, and washing paraphernalia over here, and the elder girls will bring the bedding, and we will make all their beds over here for once." She said grace, and then marshaled them out of the room, and saw over to La Petite Chalet, where the prefects took charge. Then she turned back to the Seespal, where the excited mistresses waited her. "So that is your solution to the problem?" cried Miss Maynard. "I congratulate you, madame. It's quite the best you could have made." "But why? I don't understand," said Miss Durant plaintively. "Is anything wrong that you are doing this? Herr Brahm is afraid the river may flood, and the flood badly. I don't suppose we are in any real danger, but it's best to be on the safe side. And La Petite Chalet lies lower than the chalet itself, so I decided to bring the babies over here. Now come with me, all of you, and let us decide how we can best manage." They went upstairs, and an exciting time followed while they pushed beds together and fitted in mattresses for the juniors. When 1:30 came and Miss Bethany and Miss Maynard went off to take their various classes, leaving Mademoiselle and Miss Durant to wrestle with the problem of fitting 13 extra people into the upstairs rooms. Downstairs in the big classroom, Plato struggled with the excited juniors. He wondered vaguely why they were all so much upset, but he lived largely in a fairy world of his own, and as long as they did not sing out their tune, he did not worry about them particularly. It was worse when the middle classes, for Miss Bethany felt it would be wiser to give them some explanation of the state of affairs, and they were deeply thrilled. They simply couldn't give their singing master any attention, and finally even Plato, the gentle, was roused. Flinging down his baton, he clenched his fists and hammered on the music desk, effectually awakening their interest at once. "This is terrible," he shouted. "Nay, more, it is blasphemous. You debase the divine Apollo. You wrong the celestial Eutrep. It is not to be borne." The middles looked at him with gasping surprise, though not at his invocation of Apollo. They knew all that he had to teach them about these divinities by this time. No, what startled them was his anger. During the whole of the 2 terms during which he had taken them for singing, they had never once seen his temper, and had indeed decided that he didn't possess one. Now, with his eyes blazing and the color coming and going into his cheeks, and his lips set in a thin, hard line, they suddenly realized that Plato was of once in a thorough-paced rage, and that they must be careful. For a moment no one quite knew what to say. Then suddenly the decision was taken out of their hands. An avid flash of lightning leapt across the sky, tearing the sullen grayness apart. There was an awful silence, and then a terrific crash of thunder, and at the same moment the rain came. Chapter 22. The Flood. Plato's wild outburst had brought Miss Bethany from her study. She never got any very clear idea of what had happened to upset the master, for the suddenness and awfulness of the storm brought Plato to his senses. He was thoroughly ashamed at having lost his temper, and when Miss Bethany, shouting to be heard above the noise of the rain and the thunder, asked what had happened, he stammered out something about "the little madames are excited, upset by the approach of the storm." He got no further, for Simone flung herself on the young headmistress, crying hysterically, "Oh, is it the flood? Is it the flood?" Madge shook the child. "Stop crying at once, Simone," she thundered, and Simone promptly stopped. Plato had heard the question in open-mouthed amazement. "But, sweeting," he cried, "there will not be a flood, as in the days of Noah. There cannot be. Our dear Lord has given us his promise." Madge's eyes dared the girls to laugh, while she explained rapidly that they feared. Plato's face was grave when she had finished. "I must go at once, madame. My sister is in the hotel, and it sounds even lower than the Crown Prince Karl, for it lies in the little dip near the fence. If, in truth, there is a danger of flood here, how much more there?" "Bring your sister here," suggested the young headmistress. "It will be safer, and if there should be a flood, we might need a man around." He bowed sweepingly at her. "You are kind, madame. We will come with pleasure. My dearest Sarah has a great dread of water, and she will be happier here with you. I go, and will return swiftly." They saw him crossing the enclosure with great bounding steps, before he lost in the gray mist of rain that beat down and through the skies were attempting to swamp the earth. Miss Bethany no longer doubted that the torrent would flood. It most certainly would, but she hoped that the fact that the chalet being raised above the rest of the part of the valley would tell in it favor and save them. There was quite a deep dip between them and the river, and this would be helped to carry off some of the water. "Will the whole valley be flooded?" demanded Joe suddenly. "No, I don't expect it for an instant. I think the river will overflow its banks a little, but I don't suppose it goes much farther than just the pasture round," replied Madge. "Put those desks straight, girls. Take out all your books and carry them to the stationery cupboard. I don't suppose the flood will touch us, but we won't run the risk." She hurried off to give the same commands to the other girls, and for the next hour they were busy packing away all the spoilable things, while the mistresses, Marie and Egan, provided the dormitories as if they expected a siege of the weeks. If only it had once stopped raining, Madge would have rushed the girls along to the sea-spits, but she dared not risk it in that awful downpour, and it continued all that afternoon and evening in a steady, relentless torrent. Plato duly returned with his sister, who, rejoicing in the name of Sarah, had been christened Sally Go Round the Moon by Naughty Joe, Sally for short. Sally was the short, sturdy, and plain, with a pair of twinkling brown eyes, which went far to reconciling the girls to her lack of beauty. Usually she was most matter-of-fact and full of common sense, but her brother's remark that she was terrified of water was no more than true. The twinkle had faded out of her eyes, and she was very white and shaking when she entered the head's study. "My dear, I can't thank you enough," she jerked out. "I am a perfect fool where it comes in the nature of a flood or running water is concerned." "But I question if there will be a flood," put in her brother. "The river appears to me to be lower than it was. Mayhaps the snow has ceased to melt, or the water has flooded another outlet." "I hope so indeed," said Madge absently. She left her guests to themselves and in the study, and went off to superintend matters. Later on, Miss Denny made herself useful by helping to put the juniors to bed, while her brother moved desks and heavy furniture and carried loads of fuel upstairs in case there should be needed later. By 11 o'clock at night everything was finished, and the girls were all safely in bed and sound asleep. Before she went up to her own room, where Joey and Robin were already tucked in, Miss Bethany opened the jalousies at the study window and looked out, and the rain had ceased to fall, and the full moon was struggling out from behind the ragged clouds that were chasing each other across the sky. The wind was rising and howling in the melancholy fashion among the black pine woods at the back of the house. In the distance, the steady roar of the torrent could be heard, and Madge noted that the sound seemed less than it had been earlier in the day. Clearly the river was falling, and therefore the danger was past. A heavy pad of feet behind startled her as she leaned against the window looking out, and she turned swiftly to find Zita beside her, looking at her with anxious eyes. "How you startled me, Zita," she said, with a little laugh at her own silliness. "Poor old thing! What is the matter with you, and where is Rufus?" Zita whined softly. Her dog instinct sensed coming danger, and she was doing her best to warn her young mistress. Madge closed the jalousies again and glanced round the room to see that everything was all right, and then went out, switching off the light, and followed by Zita, who kept closely to her, and the head bolted the front door and locked it safely. Mademoiselle had made the rounds of the form room earlier in the evening, and made sure that all the windows were shut, so that Miss Bethany left them alone, and went to the kitchen to take Zita to her own quarters. At the door she paused. She didn't think that was any likelihood of a flood now. Still, perhaps the two dogs should be happier on one of the upper landings. She went into the kitchen, called Rufus, who was curled up in a huge woolly ball, and went upstairs, accompanied by both animals. In her own room, Joey and Robin lay together in her bed, profoundly asleep. Anxious not to wake them, Madge began to undress by moonlight. It was a glorious night after the storm. The clouds were vanishing. The dark lake reflected the light of the moon in its tumbled waters. Madge opened the window and leaned out, reveling in the beauty that lay around her. Suddenly the expression on her face changed as a dull, thundering sound came to her. Louder and louder it grew. The dogs outside began to bay loudly. There were startled cries from the awakening girls, but Madge Bethany paid no heed to these. Her eyes were turned towards the valley where, coming with a swift, relentless sweep, a fall of water fully 6 feet high raced across. the pasturage to the lake. In a flush, she realized what had happened. The torrent had been choked somewhere up in the mountains, and this accounted for the river's falling. Then the barriers, whatever it was, had been given way, and a great mass of water had been literally hurled down the valley below. Even as the thought passed through her mind, the wall broke round the Crown Prince Karl, which for a few moments was smothered in foam. Then it raced lower, but still horrible to watch, right across the valley to the chalet. There was a minor crash as it encountered the 6-foot fence, but it was not to be expected that anything so light should prove a barrier, and the next second it broke round them, and the chalet groaned and shuddered under the force of the blow. It all happened so quickly that to Madge it seemed as if no time had elapsed between the moment when she had first seen the horrible gray-white wall of water crushing down the valley, and the moment when it broke against the school. The horror of it stunned her for a moment. Then a voice from the bed aroused her. The foot had scarcely time to flee before it brake against the knee, and all the world was in the sea. "It is the flood, isn't it? I say, that was a wanger." "Stay where you are, Joey," cried her sister, as she hurriedly pulled her dressing gown round her. "I'm going down to the others." "It's all right, Robin, darling," as the baby turned a scared white face to her. "Joey will stay with you, and I will come back soon." Then she vanished, and the two little girls were left alone together. Joey's first reaction was to tumble out of bed and race over to the window. She gasped at the sight she saw. All round there was nothing but water, which seemed to be coming momentarily deeper. Already it was well up to the first sash of the ground floor windows, and it seemed to be rushing in surges. After the first 2 or 3 washes there were no more waves. But it was quite alarming enough to see the water rising, creeping foot by foot up the side of the house. Joey could see the Crown Prince Karl, which, as it stood at a much lower level, was heavily awash to the first-floor windows. From downstairs came cries and sobs. Then there was the patter of feet as the girls climbed up to the next story. The door opened, and Madge came in. "Get up and dress," she said quietly. "Joey, you must help the Robin. I must go to Miss Denny." "I wish Mr. Jem were here," sighed Joe. "I can't think why he should be at the Innsbruck just when we need his help most." "Be quick, children," she said gently. "Help Robin and dress yourself, please." "But don't you wish he were here, Madge?" persisted Joey, as she began to put on Robin's stockings. Madge blushed and shook her head. "I must go," she said, and left them to dress. When they were ready, Joe looked out of the window once more. The water was up to the top of the ground floor windows, but as far as she could tell, was not rising now. The trouble lay in the fact that the narrowness of the valley and the usual fullness of the lake. It would drain off by way of the Tearn, but it looked like being a fairly long business. "What a mess things will be in downstairs," observed Joe. "I should think the place will be about knee-deep in mud. It'll take weeks to clean." Zita, who was near her, pushed a big sable head under her arm in search of petting. The dog knew that things were not right, and she was frightened. Joey stood up, pulling her ears absently, while Robin hugged Rufus, who had followed his mother into the room. Here Miss Bethany found them. When she came along later to bring them some hot cocoa and biscuits, and to see that all was well with them, "I'm sending Juliet up with Simone and Frida," said the head. "You are to stay here until I send for you. The others are quite safe with Miss Maynard and Miss Durant to look after them, and Mademoiselle is taking care of Miss Denny, who isn't well. There isn't room for anyone in the other rooms, so I want you to stay here. I shall be in and out all the time, and you are quite safe." They will be bringing the boats along presently, and then you shall all go over to the sea spits until the water goes down again." "And that won't be long," remarked Joey, who was hanging out of the window once more. "I do believe it's going down already. Look, Madge." Madge came and looked. "I believe you're right, Joey," she said. "It would drain away fairly quickly, of course, and the wind will help it." "What about La Petite Chalet?" asked Joey. "Well, it isn't on the same level, of course. It's a much lower house. But I don't think it has really suffered much more than this," replied Madge. "Now I must go." "Must we stay here?" pleaded Joey, catching at her sister's arm. "Let me go, Joey. Yes, of course you must." Madge went off to send up Juliet with the other two, and to help Mademoiselle to calm the fears of the more excitable girls. One or two of them were completely hysterical, and it was to prevent the impressionable children from seeing this that she kept them away from the others. Vanna de Ricci and Luigia de Ferrara, in particular, were very bad. Both were highly strung, excitable girls, and they had completely lost control. As far as possible, they had been isolated from the others, and were in Miss Maynard's little room with Brunhilde the placid and Gisela, strong and calm, with them. The others were crowded in the big green dormitory and the little blue one, so that they were all on the top floor or the second one. As the head went upstairs to send Juliet with the other two down to her room, she was confronted by Plato. "Pardon, madame," he said, with old-world courtesy. "Will you permit that I offer a suggestion?" "Yes, of course," replied Madge. "What is it?" "It is that our little damsels must sing. Music acts to calm. Let us gather on the stairs and all chorale gaily." Madge agreed that it was a good idea. There was a little silence when the singing was finished, and Miss Bethany came out of the blue dormitory. "The water is falling," she said quietly. "I think it would be as well for you all to go and lay down. The danger is past, and we hope you all are very tired. But before we go, let us thank God, who has kept us all safe in the midst of so many and great dangers." She dropped to her knees, and she spoke, and the girls followed her example. There was no thought of differences of creeds in that moment, as the school followed her through the general thanksgiving and well-known Our Father. The fatherhood of God came very near many of the elder girls then. They were all so worn out with excitement and loss of sleep that even the discomfort of their usually close quarters could not worry them. When Madge went the rounds half an hour later, it was to find nearly everyone asleep already. Gisela was awake and thrilled to the few words of thanks and praise her head mistress had bestowed on her. But the only other girl awake was Joey, who was cuddled with Robin, so soundly asleep that she scarcely moved when Miss Bethany gently lifted her out of the other child's arms and laid her down on the pillow. "I couldn't help it, Madge," said Joey. "She's so tiny, and I wanted something to hold, badly, I did." "I know," said Madge. Sat down beside her. "It's all right now, Joey." She took the hot, sticky little paw Joe thrust at her in her cool grasp. "Go to sleep, Joey, baby. All will be well now." "You won't leave us," pleaded Joe. "You'll stay with us now." "No, don't worry, darling. I won't leave you." Joey's eyes were growing heavy. Her long lashes fell onto her cheeks. "Madge, dearest," she murmured drowsily. "Oh, I do so love you. I hope Dr. Jim—" There was no more. She had fallen asleep.